Boa tarde a todas e a todos, uma vez mais. Bem-vindos à segunda edição do evento Questões Ecológicas em Perspectiva Interdisciplinar. Esta semana temos connosco o professor Mick Smith, que é professor na Escola de Estudos Ambientais e no Departamento de Filosofia da Queen's University, em Ontário, no Canadá. O professor Smith tem formação em ecologia, com interesse nas razões políticas, sociais e experienciais pelas quais as pessoas valorizam ou não certos aspectos das comunidades ecológicas, particularmente a partir da perspectiva da ética ambiental e da política ambiental. A sua pesquisa procura desenvolver uma compreensão teórica das interseções entre natureza e cultura e como estas afetam a nossa avaliação e a nossa experiência dos ambientes, desenvolvendo-se a partir de 6 eixos que, de certa forma, se tocam e se sobrepõem. Uma espécie de hermenêutica ambiental e fenomenológica, a ética ambiental, as teorias sociais acerca da natureza e do ambientalismo, a mediação emocional de respostas ambientais, a política ambiental e o lugar da natureza na teoria política e a ética do turismo. Ele atualmente ocupa-se de noções pós-humanistas de comunidade ecológica e, de entre as suas muitas publicações, que contam livros, artigos, capítulos de livros, etc., destacam-se a autoria dos livros Against Ecological Sovereignty, Ethics, Politics and Saving the Natural World, The Ethics of Tourism Development e An Ethics of Place, Radical Ecology, Postmodernity and Social Theory. Ele também co-editou as obras Emotion, Place and Culture e a obra Emotional Geographies. Ele vai hoje falar-nos de um livro que está preparando, justamente sobre estes temas da providência, relacionados à providência e à ecologia provisória. Portanto, tudo isto é novo e ele vai tentar apresentar uma espécie de resumo da obra que está prestes a ser publicada e que estará disponível em breve. Então, a sua palestra de hoje tem o título Does the Earth Care? Indifference, Providence and Provisional Ecology in an Age of Atmospheric Change. Dear Mick, thank you once again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nuno. Thank you all for the invitation. I'm very pleased to do this. As I was explaining to Nuno earlier, I don't have any fancy slides, but I'll just start now and talk for about 50 minutes, I think, about aspects of my recent work. I'm drawing in particular on a forthcoming book that's co-authored with one of my grad students, Jason Young. It's provisionally entitled Does the Earth Care? Indifference, Providence and Provisional Ecology in an Age of Atmospheric Change. So I'll begin by characterizing successive forms of the modern Western imaginary, referred to here as providence and progress. Transition between these two imaginaries in early modernity marks a movement from a theological to a more secular and humanist instrumentalization of the earth as a means for human ends. This instrumentality arises through an insidious framing of the world in forms of an all-encompassing productivism intimately associated with progress. I'll say more about this later. The key point is that this productivism reduces everything to the terms of a very specific mode of our earthly engagement, that of making or manufacturing. Here, teleology and technology, in Heidegger's sense, and again I'll say more about that later, corrosively combined in a narrow, now globalized misunderstanding about earthly relations. Contra this dominant framework, I'll offer a more ecological way to understand earthly relations in terms of the evolving and differently patterned and instantiated expressions of the Earth's provisions. This I'll refer to as earthly providence, provisional ecology. Initial claim is these previously dominant imaginaries are no longer tenable in an age of climate change. Who can think that the disasters unfolding about us are signs of earthly providence or of human progress? Rather, these disasters are in part consequences of semiotic and material enactment of these specific imaginaries, most clearly but not only exemplified through global capitalism. We should recognise that the dominance of these imaginaries has also come at the cost of the genocidal suppression of indigenous peoples and the ecocidal destruction of other places and beings that had together expressed, and in some places still express, very different patterns of existence and very different imaginaries. Before I go further, I just want to say a little bit more about this term imaginary, which isn't simply a reference to an individualized psychology, and still less to imagination as opposed to reality, nor even to various understandings of ideology. Rather, it's much closer to Benedict Anderson's notion of the nation state as an imagined community, something which is both ideationally and materially enacted. Another comparison might be to think of it in terms of a materio-semiotic, an ecological extension, the more narrowly drawn social imaginary defined by Charles Taylor, that common understanding that makes possible common practices, the widely shared sense of legitimacy. You might say that an imaginary such as that surrounding progress constitutes a pervasive atmosphere, material and semiotic possibilities within which a given society operates, one inhaled and exhaled through every interpretive, creative, generative, and destructive act, even when dreaming of alternatives. In this sense, imaginary also denotes an interpretive breathing space that, so long as it's materially and ideologically sustainable and sustaining, continues to inspire that society. Ironically, the advent of global climate change, it's clear that the imaginary associated with progress no longer has a future. Indeed, we might say that the emergence of climate change is to progress what the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was to theological providence. Whereas the emerging humanist imaginary of modernity will eventually come to re-envisage the Lisbon earthquake as a natural disaster rather than an act of God's mysterious purposes, no comparable shift or excuse is yet available for climate change. Indeed, insofar as the Anthropocene denotes the success of modernity's assimilative project, the humanization and the consequent end of nature, it also exposes the abject failure of the imaginary of progress to produce any kind of a future that remotely resembles a livable world where all the Earth's inhabitants are provided for. The atmosphere so produced is quite literally becoming unbreathable. Its waters becoming anoptic. Have we finally then reached the end of progress? If so, what might end here signify? The end of an illusion? The end of a colonizing European ideology? The end of a world? And or completion of the rather unexpected telos of modernity? What will a sublimation of this imaginary leave behind when everything that once declared itself so solid is revealed as in so much hot air? We might, of course, say that what will be left is still the Earth. However, this Earth is not what it's currently imagined to be. It's not, as in common parlance and socioeconomic practices, a resource, nor does it produce goods or ecological services, nor is Earth a mechanistic or informatic system, and so on. Such terminology only serves to misrepresent Earth, their inescapably earthly involvements and dependencies. Suppose neutrality or objectivity of such terms is entirely false. Allow, indeed encourage massively destructive projects and practices. They also tend to inframe Earth as just indifferent raw material, in Heidegger's terms, standing reserve, lacking creative or evolving agency and emotional resonance. This then is why we want to ask a very different kind of question, which has very different answers in terms of the imaginaries of providence, progress, and provisional ecologies. That question is, does Earth care? The question makes little or no sense in terms of the theological or progressive version of human exceptionalism. It's also almost entirely missing in many modernist ecological approaches too, which tend to focus on managing the Earth's resources efficiently, or at best might supplement that approach by asking how we, that is some or all humans, should care for the Earth. Okay, let me begin. First, why might we be interested in a rather archaic term like providence? To speak of earthly providence would certainly seem anachronistic and dubious in a world of devastating pandemics, mass extinction, and destabilizing climate change. Nevertheless, rethinking the legacy of that providential imaginary, which prospered in pre and early modern Europe, might still provide certain affordances for understanding and expressing responses to such issues. For all its faults, and there are many, The providential imaginary found in Earth's manifestations signs of a world infused with care, albeit a care originating in God and directed primarily or only towards humans. Within this providential imaginary, Earth was infused with inherent purposes. Wherever the theologically informed naturalists looked, they might see signs of God's providence in the ways in which everything seems so very well suited to provide the stage for human activities. That said, some, like John Ray, a naturalist and early member of the Royal Society, were willing to recognize that the Creator's purposes and care extended to more than just human beings. It's a great design of providence, says Ray, to maintain and continue every species. I shall take notice of the great care and abundant provision that's made for the securing of this end. And Ray's The Wisdom of God as manifested in the works of creation did indeed set out to detail these specific and abundant adaptations and provisions in all their diversity, all of which he deemed the effects of a sagacious and provident nature. However, Ray suggested that the physical and behavioral suitability of each species to their natural role could only be explained as a result of design. It was not, he argued, just a matter of there being a natural mechanism or nature being plastic or spermatic, evidenced existence of an all-powerful architect, engineer, and wise superintendent. Earth, he thought, had been produced with certain ends in mind. Ray exemplifies an early but cautious adoption of a technological metaphoric, one that's still wary of mechanistic illusions, speaking of such human inventions as a few dead engines or movements, compared to living beings performing their own motions. Ray, human inventions are poor additions to or parodies of God's creation that cease suddenly to move as soon as the spring is down. His purpose in emphasizing providence is rather to bring about a realization that the reason man ought not to admire himself or seek his own glory is because he's a dependent creature and has nothing but what he's received. It's also explicitly argued that the creativity of nature has purposes that are not just reducible to instrumental means for human ends. For my part, says Ray, I cannot believe that all the things in the world were so made for man that they have no other use. In Ray's providential approach, creation, although designed and produced with God's ends in mind, has not yet been reduced to the natural equivalent of a workshop or machine. And there's a heartfelt recognition that all earthly purposes are not simply subservient to human ends. One might even think as an incipient ecology. Generally speaking, though, and despite notable resistance, Ray's caution is lost in the transition between imaginaries as techniques evolve and become increasingly dominant as an element of an emergent society and progressive imaginary. Just a century later, William Hutton, one of the founding figures of geology, was fully utilizing the machine metaphor in his theory of the Earth. Hutton still retained something of a providential outlook, but was content to think that God, having designed the system for humanity, had then left it running without further direct intervention. Hutton, as Ruddick remarks, called the Earth a machine in allusion to the steam engine that was such a spectacular feature of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines demonstrated the huge expansive power of heat as one phase in a repeated cycle that could continue to operate indefinitely. The cyclic character, Hutton argued, was just what made the Earth a natural machine. Tracing how the providential imaginary evolved into a succeeding and globally dominant progressive imaginary, we can witness how it was transformed in ways that still allowed its adherents to consider themselves elect or favoured, while evacuating an increasingly objectivized Earth of all but the most superficial relations to care. That's to say, the imaginary of progress, including scientific progress, offered no respite from, indeed helped generate a systemic worldly indifference, such that referring to the Earth as caring can only appear ridiculously and unjustifiably anthropomorphic, indicative of an antiquated wishful thinking. This absence of earthly solicitude could, we suggest, be considered a symptom and not just a consequence of this predominant modern mode of engagement with the Earth. Genevieve Lloyd carefully traces how from the 17th century onwards, progress emerges as a replacement for theological and before that much more ancient notions of providence. It expresses an increasingly secular, if anything even more narrowly anthropocentric idea of agential teleology. She tracks this movement philosophically although we'd also want to emphasize its immense material-semiotic ramifications. It tracks it from Greek tragedy through Augustine, Descartes, Spinoza, Rousseau to Kant, where this change and emergent imaginary becomes explicit. Kant's argument is subtle but far-reaching. He admits that we could just interpret natural relations in terms of how their existence assures the provision of sustenance for humans. For example, we might claim that animals are placed here by God for us to domesticate, to eat, and so on. Or, he says, we could interpret the world purposefully. For example, herbivores, he says, might be there to moderate the opulent growth in the plant kingdom, which would otherwise choke many species of plants. And this approach would lead to a similarly anthropocentric, but not identical conclusion that man is there to hunt the predators of the herbivores, so establish a certain equilibrium, and puts it, between productive and destructive forces of nature. The former possibility is clearly providential, while the latter might seem to link nature's own purposiveness with a hierarchic role for human stewardship over the earth. From Kant's perspective, it has a key problem, in that it opens the door to reducing the dignity of humanity's being a purpose, leading to us only having what we might now consider a naturalized ecological and functional role. Humanity would only hold the rank of a means rather than a final end. That is, humans would become just one species amongst many, each having its naturally appointed role in what Kant calls the great system of purposes of nature. This phrase illustrates how Kant thinks it's acceptable up to a point to employ a principle of purposiveness in understanding the natural world. He deems this employment merely reflective, not determinate. In other words, we may sometimes find this attribution of purposiveness necessary as a way of thinking about ecological relations, but this doesn't actually explain those relations. Kant argues we actually have, he puts it, an obligation to give a mechanical explanation for all products and events in nature, even the most purposive, as far as it's in our capacity to do so. As for Kant and those that follow, enlightened scientific approaches try to exercise both purposive and providential explanations from their accounts of nature. The language of purpose should really be reserved, Kant thinks, for teleological human activities. The centrality of human exceptionalism to his philosophical project certainly provides one reason why Kant's unwilling to reduce humanity to their ecological role in nature's great system. However, he also argues that a more thoughtful and thorough acquaintance with the Earth's natural history shows that what looks at first sight like the purposive ordering of natural beings and habitats in which they seem to thrive is actually wholly unintentional. And what's more, is produced by, as he puts it, causes that are more likely to be devastating than to foster production, order, and purposes. Land and sea, he says, contain memorials of mighty devastation that long ago befell them, and all creatures living in or on them. Indeed, their entire structure, the strata of the land and the boundaries of the sea, look quite like the product of savage or powerful forces of a nature working in a state of chaos. In other words, Kant thinks, seen in the whole, there is no overarching purpose, order, or preordained balance of nature there to be maintained. And Kant concludes that without man, the whole of creation would be mere wilderness, a thing in vain, and have no final end. And then wants to argue that man is the ultimate purpose of creation here on Earth. He needs to do this without reverting to the naive, selective, and dubiously positive notion of theological or natural providence he's previously critiqued. His solution is to emphasize human progress. Antinomies of nature, that is, the current provision of sustenance on the one hand and its often chaotic and destructive activities on the other, are to be taken together and subsumed by and within the struggle of humanity to progressively understand and gain mastery over the natural world. In this imaginary, what harms us individually may actually help humanity over time as a whole. Man wishes concord, says Kant, with nature knowing better what is good for his species and wishes discord. Without this discord, humans, as good natures as all the sheep intended, would scarcely render their existence more valuable than that of their animals. In Kant's philosophy, nature's purposiveness is ultimately reduced to providing the sometimes challenging circumstances necessary to force humans to develop their latent potential, to assimilate nature to their own purposes. to their own ends. We might even say that this ultimate purpose is ethico-politically characterized in his idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan purpose. Indeed, the third proposition of this work describes this process in terms of nature's intent and its human supersession in what Appel refers to as a quasi-dialectical idea of the cunning of nature. Nature, says Kant, has willed that man should produce entirely by his own initiative everything that goes beyond the mechanical ordering of his animal existence. And he should not partake of any other happiness or perfection other than that which is procured for himself without instinct and by his own reason. It seems as if nature had intended that man, once he had finally worked his way up from the uttermost barbarism to the highest degree of skill, to inner perfection in his manner of thought, and thence, as far as is possible on earth, to happiness, to be able to take for himself the entire credit for doing so, and to have only himself to thank for it. How generous, we might say, of nature to take no credit. Adopting but not modern vernacular, it seems that providence in the form of nature doesn't guide history to its final end, but rather provides opportunities to be exploited by human entrepreneurs, self-made men and or man, who then takes all the credit and reaps all the profit. Here we can see how Kant anticipates the movement from a providence that's weakened but not entirely expunged, to a progress that effectively becomes a rationalist and humanist equivalent of the theodicy of good and evil, one that becomes transformed, elaborated, and material-semiotically enacted in innumerable and often incredibly destructive ways, as it inspires the imaginary of an emerging modernity. We still need, though, to follow this idea of purposefulness further. Heidegger's later work carefully unpacks the way efficient causes come to set the mechanistic standard for defining causes in general to such an extent that, in Heidegger's words, we no longer count the causa finalis, telic finality, as causality. That's to say, historically, as Kant illustrates, we've come to regard final end as playing no part in non-human nature. Heidegger's claims actually also allow us to go further, suggesting that the very idea of a final end, that is, a purpose that gives overarching meaning to things explained as having proceeded and being directed towards it, is itself an integral aspect of how the ancient Greeks and those under their influence began to think technology. Perhaps we might even say that the very idea of a final end is itself a reflective product of taking a very specific and limited technological mode of relating to the world as the model for being itself. How so? Well, first note that for Heidegger, technology is not at all a specific array of technical machinery or even a techniques in general, a mode of engagement that transforms the world through challenging and ordering it. It's a specific mode of addressing the earth where the earth is forced to appear as material for projects. Also for Heidegger, technology is not something superimposed on the world by a human being who stands apart from the world. Rather, it's an instrumentally oriented occasioning of our being in the world. Techne, from its ancient Greek origins, refers to crafting, to making artifacts for a particular purpose, an end, like a pot, or in Heidegger's example, a chalice. This end, this causa finalis, seems to be all too readily identifiable in such cases, albeit also intimately connected to the other aspects of the artifact's production, namely its intended form, the material employed, and its efficient causes. We think of the final cause of the object produced as anthropogenic because it's our designs that seem to initiate its production. The object so produced appears to us as finished when it achieves the material form that will fulfill its intended function. We're therefore drawn to say that its achievement is its telos, the final end towards its construction was always directed, and also the way it will appear at the completion of its limited task as having no further purpose. Think perhaps of Elon Musk's automobile propelled on an endless road to nowhere, a space-suited dummy propped behind the steering wheel, the perfect image, and unfortunately the reality of capitalist-driven egoism and a failing imaginary of progress. So Heidegger suggests that ideas of causation, including the idea of a final cause, are not something, as he says, fallen from heaven as a truth as clear as daylight. something inextricably associated with that limited technological mode of engagement of addressing the world, a mode which also frames and limits our modern understanding of the world. As this mode of addressing the earth comes to predominate, so we become apt to consider all aspects of our existence, our being in the world, in this terribly limited light. Heidegger's own examples famously include the river transformed into a source of hydroelectric power, the forest reduced to nothing but a source of timber. Such an orientation eventually becomes second nature to those under its thrall, even to the extent that referring to the whole earth as an assemblage of resources is assumed to be ethically, epistemologically, and politically neutral in a description of reality. In other words, we come to mistake a specific technological mode of addressing the world as a fixed ontology of a now objectified earth, and having purpose becomes entirely associated with involvement in telic productive activities. Why else is it that those seeking to defend the existence of anything at all are first of all asked, what use is it? Providing an answer to that question would only serve to further enmesh the entity within the very imaginary that threatens its existence. Something's missing here. Where we must ask in the description of the modes of causation that define techne and its extrapolation, is there any mention of what's destroyed in the process, what's wasted, what's surplus to requirements, of the cascading and never-ending after effects of the act of production? Is the destruction of the tree not also a cause of timber production? Is waste not always a product of making? Are some products not always surplus to requirements? Are some consequences of technology not always unplanned, unknown, undesired? Environmentalism, I think, might almost be defined as being the only modern ethico-political movement that, since its inception, has focused on this telic leakage, on the consequences of so-called externalities of the productive process, the toxic residues, the emissions, extinctions, erosions, the repercussions of genetic modifications, and so on and on. Of course, environmentalism's shallower versions merely suggest ways of keeping the predominant structure of productive processes going by reducing, reusing, and recycling, by more efficient use of resources, energy, and so on. That is, finding ways of internalizing externalities, bringing everything into a more expanded productivism. Such approaches generally accept rather than challenge the dominant structures of the progressive imaginary. That's not to say that reducing consumption, reusing, or recycling are entirely useless. Quite the contrary, they exemplify usefulness, but perhaps they're most creative precisely where they don't exist, in the continuation of the current imaginary. Productivism paralyzes nature, evolution, and the earth, framing it in appallingly limited ways. And this is also why Heidegger actually returns to pre-Socratic philosophies in one sense, and specifically to earlier notions of physis, to find alternative understandings in Western traditions. John Sallis argues these earlier traditions sometimes offer a figure of nature that refer questions of creation and origins back to the generation by which vegetative life germinates in the earth and emerges into the light and the open air, as well as that by which animate beings are born. It is, for Sallis, perhaps most conspicuous by contrast with later Greek philosophy, is the total lack of reference to making or production. Beings are not regarded as if they were made by the imposition of form on shapeless material. We could say that thought remains close to nature, says Sallis, keeps it apart from the paradigm of human artifice, of techne. There is hardly a trace of the dominance of techne over nature that will later set in. Physis then might offer one non-technological way of understanding Earth's creativity, and a way of distinguishing between nature and artifice that doesn't depend on making a simple ontological distinction between humanity and nature. The key point here is that preceding analysis allows us to realize that the technologically derived notion of final ends is universally overextended. We might suggest that our exceptionality, our supposedly unique association with generating or being considered the Earth's final end, comes to be justified through an unexplicated recourse to an entirely unwarranted extension of a historically and culturally specific, a Eurocentric misunderstanding of technology to the whole world, an occurrence that actually now leads that world to a very undignified destiny. Perhaps then we're beginning to have an understanding of how not to address the Earth. We've also begun to explicate a possible source of this error, one that links specific social practices with specific philosophical theory. It's not, of course, a complete explanation. It can never be so, but it seems plausible and appropriate to our situation. At issue then is how we might differently address and also be materially and semiotically addressed by the Earth, and how the Earth matters beyond human signification. Not to address the Earth technologically requires that we cease to consider our own activities as ever having a final end, and that we cease to assume or posit any kind of final purpose for creation, that we should accept the idea of a world without final ends or any universal teleology. And this requires different, plural and non-universal imaginaries. It requires that we're open to other ways of addressing the Earth. It doesn't mean we have to completely abandon speaking of nature in terms of purposes, as Kant proposes. Notice, though, that we can still speak of what is provided, even where this provision is not purposeful. Presumably, no one would disagree with the contention that the blood provides oxygen to the body. More expansively, even if it can't be described as its providential purpose, it doesn't seem at all controversial to say that spring grass provides for the deer's sustenance. Provision here means that which appears and is afforded by a conjunction or pattern of events. It does not need to imply intent, an explicable causal chain, or a teleology. There is no necessary design or plan required to do this, although of course such occurrences can sometimes be intentionally enacted if circumstances allow. Rather, it's a way of speaking of an evolutionary, ecologically, and only sometimes socially articulated conjunction of things and beings. Also notice that although ecological provision may not be designed, it's not a matter of pure chance, but of billions of years of earthly evolution. Provision is that which happens to afford possibilities for the continuation of certain temporary, provisional patterns of existence, like a human life, an ecological community, a weather pattern. It's surely not controversial to say that the Earth provides for many different things in many different ways. It is to say, if our notion of provision is not theological, but more of a matter of ecological providence, i.e. of what the Earth provides ecologically, it shifts the grounds of our understanding. When we say that the Earth provides for any being, we do not mean that the Earth as a whole deliberately sets out to provide what that being requires of it, that this is the Earth's intent or purpose. We mean instead that the existence of this specific being and the Earth are so conjoined, so inseparable, so entangled, that the very substance of that being's existence is in the Earth's provision. It is of the Earth, and in part, it is the Earth. Its existence, its form, habit, and life, all the affordances offered to it are earthly. These affordances are not just random possibilities, they are ecologically co-constitutive, patterned, evolving together. Each and every being, however transitory, is held in the Earth's embrace, and each, however small, affects the future patterning of the Earth's provision. Some of these ecological relations can be described as purposive. The feeding barnacle stretches out and rhythmically beats its feathery cirri in the shifting ocean waters. Some appear as caring. The owl provides for its young. The stickleback defends its watery territory. The otters play, coiling round and diving under each other. But these purposes are not final in any sense, and each is, in its turn, entangled with everything else, with sunlight, atmosphere, forest, the river's currents, the tidal rock pool. It seems simple enough to imagine such specific occurrences together with a few of their earthly interconnections, but more difficult to try and envisage Earth as a whole in this light. Certainly, we need to avoid describing Earth in other kinds of ways that we tend to do, as a spaceship or a machine, or as the realization or embodiment of supernatural design. Earth is not a human birthright, nor, as certain proponents of the Anthropocene might insist, something now anthropogenically produced. Not a resource, not an object. Earth is not a system, even an autopoietic one, or a Gaian goddess, not a social construct, not any kind of artifact. It is not even an organism, a superorganism, or just another planetary body. It is not even an it, since this impersonal pronoun exemplifies a grammatical separation between persons and objects, but nor is Earth a person. We cannot finally determine what the earth is. We can only say or seek or point towards encounters, words, images, ideas, experiences, understandings that express and enable different, less productive, but more creative modes of addressing and being addressed by an always evolving earth. One possibility might be earth can be understood as that which lets ecologically entangled worldings, patternings, and provisional ecologies arise and appear from itself. Such earth constitutes emerging geological, ecological, and evolving patterns of being, now also including human patternings. To refer to patterns here is intended to convey something of the sense of more or less coherent and coalesced, discernible and persistent and similarly reoccurring arrangements or dispositions of bodies, events, things, fields, forces, and so on. Patterns in this sense are not designs or blueprints, but active and evolving expressions. Earth might be interpreted as the imminent, recurrent, and successive generation and movement of these intricate patternings and the existent interdependencies at vastly different temporal and spatial scales, such that some seem but are not immutable, while others appear entirely ephemeral. Patterns are instantiated as a multiplicity of radically different, interconnected manifestations, such as the patterns of approaching storm clouds, the branching and rooting of the elm tree, the binary fission of bacteria, Earth's magnetic field, the meandering and eroding riverbank, the seasonal migration of birds, the changing constitution of your microbiome, breaking ocean waves, rotting logs, the vast array of beetles for which God, at least according to the biologist J.B.S. Haldane, seems to have an inordinate fondness, and so on and on. Consider how complicated relations in each of these and innumerable other patterning instantiations are, each mediated in what we're accustomed to think of as quite different registers, material, semiotic, phenomenal, but which are themselves all manners of expressive existence. Some patterns are concentrated, some diffuse, but involvements can be traced between and touch them all in various ways. How, for example, the rotting log composed and decomposed. It was branching elm, holding up into air, sprouting leaves eaten by caterpillars, aphids, beetles and their larvae, sheltering nests of summer birds, now becoming rich soil from which seed and sapling may again germinate and grow. The tree was, by osmosis and transpiration, drawing up rainwater, percolating through soil, water once raised as vapor to clouds from oceans and leaves surface, and then released and dropping as liquid or wintry flakes from stormy sky, fallen rain filling and shifting the course of water streaming down to sea. Birds carrying seeds, bacteria and spores migrate back and forth across seas, some following patterns of Earth's magnetic field. Wood created from leaves, sun-powered photosynthesis, transforming atmospheric carbon to carbohydrates and then to lignins. Other nutrients were translocated through soil to other trees, some of different species, via fungal mycorrhiza, entering or sheathing and connecting plant roots. Elm was felled by a storm's high winds after death consequent to infection by other fungal spores and bacteria introduced by scolited beetles that leave intricate patterns of their feeding engraved under now peeling and shedding bark. Fungi softening wood repeat with springtails, millipedes, also insects with symbiotic microbiomes that digest the material resulting from lignocellulose degradation. Microbiomes like but so differently constituted that our own recently discovered but already themselves depleted microbiomes. Rotting wood attracts ants and more beetles, some to find provision and shelter, some directed there to die by parasitic fungi infecting insect nerves and bodies, altering their behavior, wreathing insect bodies in shrouds of fungal hyphae, bursting from chitinous exoskeletons to release new spores, and on and on. And this description only begins to elaborate what happens to compose and decompose almost every log on Earth in the normal pattern of events, that is, without sudden flood or volcanic eruption, firestorm or timber extraction. There is no end to these patternings, tracing, touching, involvements, expressions, whether phenomenal, pheromonal, phylogenetic, physical, phytochemical, phenolic, phytophagous, philic, phenological, and only now in such moments as this, philosophically extrapolated. There is no possibility of tracing all of these partially interdependent and interwoven movements, no single path to follow to an end, no pattern that predominates forever. Rather, these patterns, as the world implies, appear to recur with different rhythms and temporalities, whether those of lives or generations, of seasons, days, and so on, subtling ways varying in every instance. Earth creates, but not at all like a workshop or a production line. Indeed, in an important sense, it does not work at all. To say the Earth doesn't work doesn't mean that the Earth is broken or failing, but it is composed in manners that have no overall object or purpose, but are composed and decomposed in its own multifarious gatherings. We might even say, borrowing a term from Jean-Luc Nancy, the Earth is the original and inhuman inoperative community, the differential sharing out and exposure of material-semiotic patterns of existence. The Earth naturally creates a world out of itself, a world composed of many worlds, that's to say many modes of the Earth's patterning manifestations, each comprising, enacted by and exposed to differently patterned beings. The world appears, but not just as it appears to me or to you. Here then we might offer another provisional, but by no means final, again, attempt at delimiting the Earth. Earth can be understood as the generative gathering together, the sheltering allowance of all these patterns and expressions, however discrete or nebulous, obvious or hidden. The provisional sustaining of the decomposition of the patterning it lets rise. How, though, does that help with our question, does the Earth care? Not enough that the Earth has done all this, that in all of its unfathomable creativity it's given rise to, provided for, and still continues to provision the existence of so many diverse forms of existence in all their interrelations. Should we really require Earth to care too? Should we not just accept no possibility of this being the case, and hence no solace to be found in such a notion? That care is a form of relation exemplified and reaching its zenith in human interrelations, and even here, it's something of a scarce commodity, only manufactured in certain social circumstances. Modern reluctance to refer to the Earth as provisional and caring rather than entirely indifferent obviously circulates precisely because we consider care as something only exercised with intent and purpose, exemplified by certain ethical forms of subjective or sentient human behavior, for example, in idealized parent-children relations. In Kantian terms, ethical care is a manner of addressing and providing for another as an end in itself, not as an instrumental means to our own ends. But of course, as we already seen, the Earth doesn't fit within a Kantian system. Rather, it exemplifies the ways all provisions are only temporary and imperfect, and never provide for us only as ends in ourselves, because nothing ever is an end in itself, or for that matter, simply a means to an end. Everything is always ecologically implicated. Such complications actually apply to human care too. It's always temporary, although in some instances it might last a lifetime, and imperfect, and it always involves the relational interdependence of others' materiality, meanings, lives, and deaths. Varieties of feminist ethics of care exemplify. Feminist care ethics also explicitly recognizes the importance of caring as an emotional involvement in specific circumstances, and the vital importance of feelings of being cared for as something quite distinct from, and not subsumed under, the abstract or objective apportioning of ethical standing, as for example in Kantian rights. The feminist ethics of care is always already entangled and contextual. It recognizes incompatible, indeed incommensurable requirements that continually challenge and potentially dissolve any categorical imperatives. An ecological ethics where provision of one often requires deprivation, even death for other beings, and where perpetual peace, ecologically speaking, is never going to be an option, might well take something like this form. La Casa, for example, suggests that care is something that percolates through Earth, in this case quite literally, through agricultural soils, whether or not humans are necessarily present. Why should it seem so strange to say that the Earth cares for us? Of course, it doesn't just provide for us, humans, or even provide for us all of the time, just the way we expect or we might desire it to. It doesn't provide a never-ending cornucopia of delights. However, as we've already noted, Earth does provide our very existence, and of course, as mortal and ecologically unexceptional beings who partake in the Earth, we too will eventually find ourselves providing for other beings, whether or not we care to do so. Some earthly provisions are clearly matters of caring for others. Humans are not the only beings that care for their young. They're not the only beings to direct their activities towards the provision of others, or even give their very lives to ensure such provision. In our provisional ecological approach, these sometimes caring organisms do not just live upon the surface of, but actually in part constitute the Earth. And so it seems to that extent, care in all its various forms is also constitutive of the patterning of the Earth, its ecology. In other words, it's not simply possible to say that the Earth is necessarily, inherently, objectively, or wholly indifferent to every life or concern, just that it may not care as an abstract whole. Care is present only when and where care becomes manifest. The answer can't be a simple yes, then Earth does care, or no, Earth does not care, but a recognition that caring is one of the very many registers in which the Earth provisionally manifests, or worlds. The modern presumption is that the Earth is uncaringly indifferent, but how can this be so if it's partly constituted by care, and albeit imperfectly and temporarily provides so well for beings, including humans, that previously an entire providential imaginary was grounded on the idea that this provision can only be explained by reference to a caring God. It provides no kind of resolution to simply say that the natural world sometimes appears as harmful, sometimes as caring. It must in reality be neither. Rather, the Earth is never just harmful, caring, or indifferent. Indeed, Earth is never just there like an object waiting to be explained. Rather, it's always creatively present in and as it continually manifests, as it whirls in all its complexity, a complexity of which we are now, and for just a little while, an integral part. So if we say Earth cares, we're not just making a claim that non-human nature provides and cares for humans. Many, perhaps most aspects of Earth's manifestation can't by any stretch of the imagination be deemed caring. Rather, we're speaking of how care appears and disappears in the more than just human world. A provisional ecology is not all about us, but whether we recognize certain occurrences as manifesting care is a matter of how we address the Earth and of how the more than human Earth is able to address us. Care appears as expressions and configurations of relational patternings of existence that for a while, whether intentionally or not, touch upon and serve to sustain or succor particular beings and things, all too brief existence, in the face of forces that would otherwise dissipate or damage them sooner rather than later. Perhaps to regard Earth as, amongst other things, a source of provision and care rather than an indifferent material or prospective resource might provide some solace and hope against cold realism and or an alienated despair in the face of ecological disaster. Okay, I'm going to stop there if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Mick. It was amazing, brilliant talk. We already have at least one question. I will try to translate it, and then I will also ask you a few questions of my own. I'll try to translate because the question is in Portuguese.
Yeah, I was hoping my Jason would be here. I don't think he is, because I thought I could then pull the really difficult questions onto him.
Okay. I think that's not really fair, but okay.
No, it's not fair.
So Marley says, congratulations for your talk. How do you understand the relations between the ideational and behavioral relations of culture and their manifestation through design or material culture? In face of the state of affairs and the need to reorient our course, considering the relations between ideas, behaviors, and material worlds. Where can we begin with more reflective approaches on the ecological questions in the field of design and related disciplines?
That's a big question. Yeah. I think what I would try and say is not to reduce it straight away to how we find some use for this or are able to articulate it in terms of design. I think what's more important in some ways is actually that we find ways to consider our relations to the earth before we think of how to then directly engage them in some kind of I don't know, depending design in various different ways, I guess, right? Designs of how we design a society, how we design culture, how we design. The fact is that we may not be able to design everything. Actually imposing designs or the belief that we can design everything, or the belief there might be, for example, a technological solution to this misses, I guess, the idea that it's the technological approach that is causing this a problem in the first place. It's the lack of any other approach, the failure to recognize the complexity and diversity of different human modes of addressing the earth and the way the earth addresses us. So in some senses, art, and especially ecological kind of oriented art, can often do this, right? There's a way in which we can express those kinds of concerns, maybe through film, maybe through painting, through various theatrical arts and so on, right? All of those things can express something of that diversity, which is currently lost, instantly converted into a kind of a teleological approach where we say, okay, here's the problem, how do we fix it? And then we start to produce a kind of fix that's going to get everything and sort it all out. We just really are in a position at the moment where we have no clue where we're standing, I think. We don't know what to do. And I think as the situation becomes worse, which it will if climate change is already underway, the tendency is going to be to go to ever and ever bigger technological fixes. Try and do the kind of geoengineering kind of approaches towards things that will put a single fix down. But we know from past experiences never work because there are always these unpredicted telic leakages. And telic leakages on those kind of scales, okay, cause all kinds of problems. They could make the situation much worse, not much better. And again, I'm probably getting a little away from it. So I don't think there's any one answer to that. I think we need to try and understand our situation, and I think this is why we need to be philosophically engaged in this too, right? Because rather than running straight away to thinking, oh, we better fix this, I think we better understand where trying to fix everything for our own interests has led us in the past. Now that might seem like a give up all hope kind of approach, and I must admit I'm not terribly hopeful about the fact that things are going to be organized and developed and changed in such a way that we're going to avoid some of the very serious consequences of what's happening at the moment. I think what we don't need to do is jump straight into fixes or designing a future. What we need to do is actually engage in a kind of politics and ethics, but one that is open to engagement and listening to and experiencing more than just human, rather than thinking, oh, this is something humans alone can fix. So I think environmental ethics is really crucial. It's not an add-on. It's not something we can just simply add on to the usual humanist kind of approaches toward things. It's very much something that has to be integral. We have to provide and create ways of experiencing Earth as caring, of understanding that care is part of the patterning of the Earth, and then maybe we can work on ways in which caring becomes, work on it. If I fall into straight out, I can work on these ways in which care can become. We can open spaces for care. I think that's what we have to do. We have to open spaces for care in all kinds of ways, recognizing the diversity of care rather than thinking that we can impose a particular pattern on it. Sorry, that was a long, rambling answer.
Thanks. I have a few answers of my own, questions of my own. I would like to ask you, first of all, you talked about our imaginary and the need to, in some way, to revisit that imaginary. How do you see the developments in areas such as the Earth system sciences and all the talk surrounding the Anthropocene and all that?
Yeah. There's several different ways that that's approached, I think. In the book, the thing that we talk most about is Gaia. So we talk actually about the Lovelock's notion of his kind of systems theory approach towards the Earth, which gave rise, I guess, to modern Earth system science in many respects, right? So despite the fact that when it was first suggested, it was just deemed as being too providential, right? Actually, it was criticized because it seemed to have a kind of providential undercurrent to it. Nonetheless, that's become now system science in many ways, right? There's also a mechanistic aspect of Lovelock's work as well. So one of the things we do in the book is actually use that Gaia as a way of trying to answer, in some senses, the question you're asking, or provide at least some guidance as to how to approach it, because Lovelock is a really interesting character. On the one hand, the form of systems theory he uses is perhaps the most mechanistic form of systems theory there is. It's not second order or it's not Maturana and Varela. It's very much a kind of earlier mechanistic form of systems theory. So in that sense, might say, as someone like Latour refers to him, in terms of being kind of mechanistic. But one thing he does when he's writing is he absolutely refuses to use a mechanistic image for Earth per se. Constantly, he keeps coming back to this theme that the Earth is not a machine. So there's this real tension in his own work, right? There's an incredible tension in his work. On the one hand, he's trying to describe it in mechanistic terms, and in the other, his most hated metaphor is the spaceship Earth metaphor, right? Constantly, he brings this out and criticizes. The Earth is not a spaceship. It's not that. Sometimes he'll say, oh, it's a superorganism kind of thing or whatever. And actually, what comes out of it is that we can't put a particular single metaphor on the Earth in a way of trying to understand it. This causes certain problems when we try and do it. And that to try and think of it as a system, well, if we think of the origin of cybernetics and so on, right? Its origin is evil with, information technology, right? It is, in a sense, a more modern version of a technological approach. It's not steam engines like William Hutton was talking about. It's very much technologically based. We all live in a web now of, of interconnections that are, informatic and so on. So it's easy for us to try and extend that and say, well, okay, we were wrong when we thought the Earth was, a steam engine, but hey, it's an informatic system. That's what it really is. And so once we understand informatic systems, because hey, we produce them. So if we produce them, then we must be able to fix them when they go wrong, right? And it's interesting that in Lovelock's latest book, gets quite optimistic, only on the basis that actually, informatic systems are going to take over and they'll be much more intelligent than humans, right? So, which doesn't really leave us with much hope, actually, right, in that sense. And certainly as somebody who's interested, one of my main concerns is actually, caring for, trying to conserve some of this pattern diversity that has evolved over this 4.5 billion years of the Earth's existence. Not expunging it in a fraction of a second. I think there's another aspect of what you say in terms of the Anthropocene, which is really kind of crucial. The Anthropocene's been touted as this new epoch, new geological epoch, but it's not a geological epoch. It's a disaster, right? It's basically what it is the equivalent of the meteorite hitting the Earth 65 million years ago. In terms of a geological timescale, it's that short, right? Whatever happened to the dinosaurs is about to happen to, estimates vary as to how many of the species on this planet. But they're all very, very high, right? A significant proportion. This will be a sixth great extinction. And, humans may survive, they may not. Some humans might. Some rich humans are already, trying to find their way off into space and find a technological solution to it where they can go and trash another planet, I'm sure, right? But, most of us are stuck here. Well, not stuck here. We live here. We are part of here, right? That's the point. We're part of here. And caring should involve that ethical consideration for the other patterns that co-evolved with us. Okay. That's not probably answers your question.
Thanks. I will ask you a question from other person, and then I'll come back. I don't want to monopolize the thing. Philippe Karasek, he asks, he says that he researched in his PhD the interpretation of nature in Nietzsche, and identifies himself with that way of thinking. Interpretation, reinterpretation, reconstruction of the notion of nature in Western thought, to think and rethink the ecological question. However, in the last years, some publications suggest an ecology without nature. He's referring to Timothy Morton, as a strategy to reconstruct an ecology via aesthetics, and without the equivocations committed in the name of the idea of nature. Would you like to comment or address this issue?
There's a lot of ways in which, for various reasons, people have been trying to predict the end of nature for a very long time. In a sense, I guess you could say, the idea that there's no, we have to be careful about what nature is, right? Because trying to say what nature is very, very difficult, right? Because we tend to think of nature as something apart from humans. And one of the things we're trying to get over here is that it's not apart from humans, it's something that humans are a part of, right? So inescapably, right? So I think Timothy Morton has some really interesting ideas, but I don't think we can get rid of this idea of nature and just throw it out, as it were, right? Because in a sense, various ideas of nature, almost as much as the various ideas of humanity, are what have composed the canon, I guess, of Western philosophical traditions. Some people might say that nature is, well, perhaps the most complicated word in the English language. It's certainly been said. So what does it mean to have to be without nature? Well, it depends what we mean. I think we can't do without it. I think we need to refer to it. We have to be very careful about how we refer to nature. And we have to be very careful that what we're not doing when we do this is expunging a way of actually having emotional and ethical connections to the more than just human world. It's all very well to say that we can make it just aesthetic. I think ethics and emotions, so on, play a huge part in the way we exist and understand our existence. One of the things we look at is the notions of nature have changed historically, and they certainly have done that. It's precisely how, I guess, as I kind of try and talk about a little bit in today, we've often changed in a way that makes the earth and nature indifferent to humanity, right, or indifferent to what happens. I think that's a serious problem, because it leaves people feeling alienated. Like it introduces it. Well, it doesn't just introduce. This is something that's built on something that's there in the Western philosophical canon as a whole. Right, is a kind of notion of alienation from nature. Say suddenly that nature has disappeared. Well, what does that mean? I mean, if we look at recent storms, if we look at the temperatures and so on, what is that if that's not nature, right? What is that? What are we going to call it? Are we going to think of another name for it? Why would we do that, right? Why would we just throw out all of that history of different, very different understandings of nature just to I don't know, market a particular notion of an anthropocenic philosophy. So I like some of the work that Timothy Morton does. I think his early stuff on Shelley, for example, which people don't read at all, is very, very interesting. And nature is a kind of crucial term in there, right? I think he has some really interesting ideas. But I have some serious problems, which I won't go into here, right, with the kind of new materialism that underlies some of these approaches.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Your approach seems to me to be utterly phenomenological, even in the way you try to circumvent issues like that, between the distinction between nature and human, and you resort to the earth, the idea of the earth as provisional and caregiving to a caregiving earth. Do you relate this your conception of the earth as caregiving to something like what we call in phenomenology Gegebenheit, or even Ergebnis in Heidegger's thought? And what would be the consequences of that, if that is the idea, in regards to ethics and politics? Are we allowed to continue thinking of ethics as environmental ethics, for instance, or just ethics and nothing more?
Right, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. Maybe I'll try and deal with the second bit first, right? Right. Are we dealing with just ethics? I think there's many ways of framing ethics, obviously, too, right? So I guess there are certain kind of traditions of ethics that this has more in common with than others. So clearly, it's quite critical of the mainstream kind of Enlightenment approach towards ethics. It's human, it's with its residual, well, explicit humanism, right? It is, in some senses, not that far removed from a kind of, some aspects of Levinas's work, I guess, right? So, in that sense, although Levinas too is, humanist in so many ways, particularly that he's not concerned at all to talk about anything as having an ethical calling from anything other than the human face, right? In a sense, right? And that's obviously limited, right, in the way that we think about it. I think we need to reconceptualize what ethics is. I think we have to also do it in a pluralistic way, right? And recognize there are very different ways in which we can talk about ethics, and the ways that we talk about them have very different implications. I think I would be wary to give up the notion of environmental ethics yet, because I don't think environmental ethics has actually been taken seriously yet at all, right? So I think environmental ethics
That's
is just,
true.
it has not actually become mainstream in any sense, right? Yeah, it's just like seen as a small version of applied ethics. That some people, you can take this theory here, you take a bit of utilitarianism and apply it to nature, or a bit of rights theory, apply it to nature, right? This kind of thing. No, there's very little. It's not true to say there's very little. Maybe this perhaps links to the first bit. More interesting ways in which people have tried to make connections have often been phenomenological. And I think of people like Ted Toadvine and people like that here, right, who are really trying to stretch phenomenology and do so using figures like Hochschild and people like this, right, to start to recognize the plurality of different worlds out there that are not human worlds, the phenomenal worlds that are not human worlds, all together in this kind of Nancy's kind of way, a kind of worlds within worlds, if you like. I don't know. There is share the world in general, if you like, is this sharing out of all of these different worlds, most of which we have no clue even exist. Right? Let's be honest about it. So there are certain kinds of ethics that might come out of that. Some of the ethics that come out are, well, hey, we should be really careful what we do, right? Because we don't have a clue actually what we're dealing with when we deal with the earth. We think we do, and I think there's a lot to be learned here from a lot of indigenous cultures that do have the notion of respect for earth and an earth that might be caring too in many respects. Not just caring, but care is one of the aspects of that earth in terms of it's something that we have to dig really hard to recuperate within the Eurocentric kind of philosophical tradition, I think, to find those approaches. And yes, I think there's something. There is a more of a discussion of Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger too, in the book, the problems with his approaches, particularly the problem with his notion of humans as being what we might call an overseer, right? An overseer in the sense of someone who looks after, but also someone who sees everything in a way, right? Has this overarching view of the world around us. And there's only humans that are able to understand the earth as this gathering of different worlds, right? So that we discussed that at some length in the book. And I think that's a real problem. Heidegger's. It's the residual humanism in his approach, which doesn't allow him to move past that at all. There's really interesting aspects of the way he approaches things, especially when he's talking about notions like event, for example, where he's talking about what he calls not so much a conceptual grasping of things, but an inceptual grasping of the earth. And with that inceptual thing, because it's not conceptual, it becomes actually very difficult for him to draw that absolute line between human understandings of this gathering and more than just human experiences of that gathering. So that's a kind of weakness, which I guess is maybe pointed to a little bit by Derrida in some ways. I think it's a weakness that can, from an environmental ethics point of view, could really be exploited, right? In the sense of, like, okay, so this is where Heidegger goes wrong, right? Or he goes wrong in many, many ways, including most obviously his politics, right? So, but this, right, is pointing to a way of seriously challenging that and saying, okay, let's push you on this theme, right? If we're talking about inceptual, this kind of Why is that tied to, specifically to human existence, a human mode of existence? Perhaps it doesn't even require words. Actually, we can't even put it into words, right? Perhaps it's something we can't conceive of in its entirety, but it's only something that we gather a particular sense of through our experiences. So yes, you're right. There's lots of phenomenology. It's very phenomenologically driven. It's also, I think, interpretive, right? I think it has to be interpretive. It's more Gadamer than Husserl.
That for me is a good thing, because I tend to think these issues also from a phenomenological point of view. I tend to lean on Hannah Arendt and her views on the same stuff, because I really think that they go a little bit beyond what Heidegger has proposed. But I would like to ask you a final question to let you go, and because you must be tired already. Just to explain a little bit more about your approach to the feminist ethics of care, because we have a seminar on feminism and currently, and it would be great to take some of your views to the seminar also. Thanks.
Yeah. I just think it's so generative in so many ways, because it starts from experience, because it starts from what it means to care in so many very different circumstances, and recognizes, whether it's what it means to care or what it means to love, what it means to be involved in particular circumstances and particular environments. And that, although that wasn't specifically developed to a great degree, apart from in feminist views of environmental ethics, it's crucial, right? If we want to think about how we're involved in the earth, how we're involved in part of it, how we're caught up, how we can't do anything, how there's no perfect answers to something, and how no way of abstracting from it to provide overarching rules. So what I like about it is various strands of feminist ethics of care that I really like are those that I guess are more anarchic, right? That are actually less interested in compromising with rule-based or axiological systems of ethics, and more concerned to offer this as a genuine alternative that begins, in some senses, in the only sense that it can end, carries on, if you like, in those circumstances and through those circumstances, and through recognizing the intimate involvements that we have, and the intimate involvements that we're not even necessarily aware of, and the implications that we always have for any action we have, in the way that it cascades into affecting others. But there's also an aspect of it that I think is really important, which is a cultivation of an awareness of the impossibility of perfection or purity. That there is no possibility of earthly possibility of that, right? That nothing we can do is ever absolutely right or absolutely wrong. That all we can do is try to live with and care with and conserve the others around us. And that requires that we're open to recognizing the others and recognizing that they're not just means to our ends, right? And in some senses, they're not caught up in a world over which we have any sovereign power, right? We're not in that position. There is no, there is no ecological sovereignty, right? That is, we're not entitled to lay claim to the earth. We're only a part of it.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would have many more questions, but we're out of time. So I would like to thank you once again for accepting our invitation and for your sympathy, both here and in our exchanges via email, and let's keep talking, and we'll see about the future collaboration in the volume to be published. Thank you once again, Mick, and see you soon.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, and I hope we will keep in touch. And and so I just want to thank everyone for the really good questions. And I just hope some of the answers answered some of it. But if anybody is interested in looking at the entire thing, then they can just email me and I'll send them a copy of it. Right?
Okay, thank you. I think I will do that. Thanks again. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much for